Section 18 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 3, by Henry Gray. The Subclavian Artery, Part 2. The basilar artery, Arteria basilaris, so named from its position at the base of the skull, is a single trunk formed by the junction of the two vertebral arteries. It extends from the lower to the upper border of the pons, lying in its median groove, under cover of the arachnoid. It ends by dividing into the two posterior cerebral arteries. Its branches on either side are the following: pontine, anterior inferior cerebellar, internal auditory, superior cerebellar, posterior cerebral. The pontine branches, rami ad pontem, transverse branches, are a number of small vessels which come off at right angles from either side of the basilar artery and supply the pons and adjacent parts of the brain. The internal auditory artery, arterius auditiva interna, auditory artery, a long slender branch, arises from near the middle of the artery. It accompanies the acoustic nerve through the internal acoustic meatus, and is distributed to the internal ear. The anterior inferior cerebellar artery, arterius cerebelli inferior anterior, passes backward to be distributed to the anterior part of the undersurface of the cerebellum, anastomosing with the posterior inferior cerebellar branch of the vertebral. The superior cerebellar artery, arterius cerebelli superior, arises near the termination of the basilar. It passes lateralward immediately below the oculomotor nerve, which separates it from the posterior cerebral artery, winds around the cerebral peduncle close to the trochlear nerve, and, arriving at the upper surface of the cerebellum, divides into branches which ramify in the pia mater and anastomose with those of the inferior cerebellar arteries. Several branches are given to the pineal body, the anterior medullary velum, and the tela choroidea of the third ventricle. The posterior cerebral artery, arteria cerebri posterior, is larger than the preceding, from which it is separated near its origin by the oculomotor nerve. Passing lateralward, parallel to the superior cerebellar artery, and receiving the posterior communicating from the internal carotid, it winds around the cerebral peduncle and reaches the tentorial surface of the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, where it breaks up into branches for the supply of the temporal and occipital lobes. The branches of the posterior cerebral artery are divided into two sets: ganglionic and cortical. Ganglionic: posterior medial, posterior choroidal, posterolateral. Cortical: anterior temporal, posterior temporal, calcarine, parieto-occipital. Ganglionic: the posteromedial ganglionic branches are a group of small arteries which arise at the commencement of the posterior cerebral artery. These, with similar branches from the posterior communicating, pierce the posterior perforated substance, and supply the medial surfaces of the thalami and the walls of the third ventricle. Posterior choroidal branches run forward beneath the splenium of the corpus callosum, and supply the tela choroidea of the third ventricle and the choroid plexus. The posterolateral ganglionic branches are small arteries which arise from the posterior cerebral artery after it has turned around the cerebral peduncle. They supply a considerable portion of the thalamus. Cortical: the cortical branches are the anterior temporal, distributed to the uncus and the anterior part of the fusiform gyrus, the posterior temporal, to the fusiform and the inferior temporal gyri, the calcarine, to the cuneus and gyrus lingualis and the back part of the convex surface of the occipital lobe, and the parieto-occipital, to the cuneus and the precuneus. 2. The thyrocervical trunk, truncus thyrocervicalis, thyroid axis, is a short, thick trunk which arises from the front of the first portion of the subclavian artery, close to the medial border of the scalenus anterior, and divides almost immediately into three branches: the inferior thyroid, transverse scapular, and transverse cervical. The inferior thyroid artery, arteria thyroidea inferior, passes upward in front of the vertebral artery and longus colli, then turns medialward behind the carotid sheath and its contents, and also behind the sympathetic trunk, the middle cervical ganglion resting upon the vessel. Reaching the lower border of the thyroid gland, it divides into two branches, which supply the postero-inferior parts of the gland, and anastomose with the superior thyroid and with the corresponding artery of the opposite side. The recurrent nerve passes upward generally behind, but occasionally in front of the artery. The branches of the inferior thyroid are inferior laryngeal, tracheal, esophageal, ascending cervical, muscular. The inferior laryngeal artery, arteria laryngea inferior, ascends upon the trachea to the back part of the larynx under cover of the constrictor pharyngis inferior, in company with the recurrent nerve, and supplies the muscles and mucous membrane of this part, anastomosing with the branch from the opposite side and with the superior laryngeal branch of the superior thyroid artery. The tracheal branches, rami trachealis, are distributed upon the trachea, and anastomose below with the bronchial arteries. The esophageal branches, rami esophagae, supply the esophagus and anastomose with the esophageal branches of the aorta. The ascending cervical artery, arteria cervicalis ascendens, is a small branch which arises from the inferior thyroid as that vessel is passing behind the carotid sheath. It runs up on the anterior tubercles of the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae in the interval between the scalenus anterior and longus capitis. To the muscles of the neck it gives twigs which anastomose with branches of the vertebral, and it sends one or two spinal branches into the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramina to be distributed to the medulla spinalis and its membranes, and to the bodies of the vertebrae, in the same manner as the spinal branches from the vertebral. It anastomoses with the ascending pharyngeal and occipital arteries. The muscular branches supply the depressors of the hyoid bone and the longus colli, scalenus anterior, and constrictor pharyngis inferior. The transverse scapular artery, arteria transversa scapulae suprascapular artery, passes at first downward and lateralward across the scalenus anterior and phrenic nerve, being covered by the sternocleidomastoideus. It then crosses the subclavian artery and the brachial plexus, and runs behind and parallel with the clavicle and the subclavius, and beneath the inferior belly of the omohyoideus, to the superior border of the scapula. It passes over the superior transverse ligament of the scapula, which separates it from the suprascapular nerve, and enters the supraspinatus fossa. In this situation it lies close to the bone, and ramifies between it and the supraspinatus, to which it supplies branches. It then descends behind the neck of the scapula, through the great scapular notch and under cover of the inferior transverse ligament, to reach the infraspinatus fossa, where it anastomoses with the scapular circumflex and the descending branch of the transverse cervical. Besides distributing branches to the sternocleidomastoideus, subclavius, and neighbouring muscles, it gives off a suprasternal branch, which crosses over the sternal end of the clavicle to the skin of the upper part of the chest, and an acromial branch, which pierces the trapezius and supplies the skin over the acromion, anastomosing with the thoracoacromial artery. As the artery passes over the superior transverse ligament of the scapula, it sends a branch into the subscapular fossa, where it ramifies beneath the subscapularis, and anastomoses with the subscapular artery, and with the descending branch of the transverse cervical. It also sends articular branches to the acromioclavicular and shoulder joints, and a nutrient artery to the clavicle. The transverse cervical artery, arteria transversa colli, transversalis colli artery, lies at a higher level than the transverse scapula. It passes transversely above the inferior belly of the omohyoideus to the anterior margin of the trapezius, beneath which it divides into an ascending and a descending branch. It crosses in front of the phrenic nerve and the scalene, and in front of or between the divisions of the brachial plexus, and is covered by the platysma and sternocleidomastoideus, and crossed by the omohyoideus and trapezius. The ascending branch, ramus ascendens, superficial cervical artery, ascends beneath the anterior margin of the trapezius, distributing branches to it, and to the neighbouring muscles and lymph glands in the neck, and anastomosing with the superficial branch of the descending ramus of the occipital artery. The descending branch, ramus descendens, posterior scapular artery, passes beneath the levator scapulae to the medial angle of the scapula, and then descends under the rhomboideae along the vertebral border of that bone as far as the inferior angle. Its